according to the tables which we have assembled, it is our estimate that 4% of the American people own 85% of the wealth of America, and that over 70% of the people of America don't own enough to pay the debts that they owe. How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with. Now, how are you going to feed the balance of the people? What's Morgan and Baruch and Rockefeller and Mellon going to do with all that grub? They can't eat it. They can't wear the clothes. They can't live in the house. Give them a yacht. Give them a palace. Send them to Reno and give them a new wife when they want it. If that's what they want. But when they've got everything on the God's living earth that they can eat and they can wear and they can live in, and all that their children can live in and wear and eat and all their children's children can use, then we got to call Mr. Morgan and Mr. Mellon and Mr. Rockefeller back and say, come back here. Put that stuff back on this table here that you took away from here, that you don't need. Leave something else for the American people to consume. And that's the program. We're not going to destroy the Gulf Refining Company. We're not going to destroy the Standard Oil Company. But we're going to say that the limit of any one man's stock ownership in the Standard Oil Company is from $3 to $5 million to that individual, and that the balance of the people of America own the balance of what the Standard Oil Company is worth. All right. Then we start from the bottom, that the 25 or more million American families shall have a homestead, a home, and the comforts of a home, including an automobile and a radio, the things it takes in that house to live on. We say to America, 125 million, none shall be too big, none shall be too poor, none shall work too much, none shall be idle. No luxurious mansions empty, none walking the streets, none impoverished, none in pestilence, none in want, but in the land blessed by the smile of the Creator, with everything to be consumed, to be eaten, to be worn, that America will become a land sharing the fruits of the land, not for the favored few, not to satisfy greed, but that all may live in a land in which the Lord has provided an abundance sufficient for the luxury and convenience of the people in general, I think.
I welcome this kind of examination.
I am paying for this microphone.
What difference does it make?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
I'm just a patsy.
Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war.
Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
The United States is owned by foreign corporations. Do you really care? And if anybody cares, they're considered crazy.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Man, all the humanity and all
the controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
An unspeakable tragedy. Dead on arrival.
And I will go to my grave being at peace about it.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Don't give up. Don't ever give up.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
This is Christopher Bolin. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.D. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 059, Huey P. Long, Ascension and Assassination of the Kingfish. Our guest tonight is Donald Jeffries, who will join us next in the Midnight Hour. Now, the castle is pretty dirty this evening, and it needs a lot of work. Now, some of you may have noticed a blank website recently, and to make a long story short, we transferred the domain and we transferred the contents of the website last week, and basically it crashed in the midst of both. So we're now paying GoDaddy an exorbitant amount to fix it all. So hopefully they will, and hopefully it'll be very soon. The good news is that it should be up within a few days, but we do want to apologize. That's what happened. You know, we haven't disappeared. We haven't decided to go without a site. We just simply had a crash. So believe me, no one is more frustrated than I am at this point, but we're doing everything we can to get it up for you ASAP. And this is a good time to mention that we also have a donation button on the website, MidnightRiderNews.com, when it's back up. If you really want to help us out and I can't tell you how appreciative we would be. So I've always said that we run on dreams and donations, and well, we do. But we have big dreams, but right now we need the donations. So please consider us this week, and thank you for doing so. We'll be right back with Donald Jeffries. On August the 16th, 2017, Midnight Rider News released our tribute to Jim Mars. 28 researchers, colleagues, friends, and fans joined Midnight Rider News in discussing the life, career, and memories of Jim Mars. If you would like to hear that tribute, go to MidnightRiderNews.com and download episode 13 of the Midnight Rider News Show today. Donald Jeffries is a friend of your friendly neighborhood host. He's a friend of the show, and he's an all-around hail fellow well met. He's the author of 2 must-read books, Hidden History, an expose of modern crimes, conspiracies, and cover-ups in American politics, and Survival of the Richest, how the corruption of the marketplace and the disparity of wealth created the greatest conspiracy of all. Now, he's been on the show discussing both of those works, so please check out those episodes when you can. And again, they are mandatory books for anyone interested in challenging the establishment. So if you don't have them, you can go to MidnightRiderNews.com where we have links, or you can buy them on Amazon.com or on many of the best online booksellers. In fact, if you'd like to read Donald's eloquent take on Huey Long, our topic tonight, that's a chapter in Survival of the Richest, so please get that one. And I can't say enough good things about him. You all know how much I appreciate his work, so let's just bring him in now. Donald, how are you this fine evening?
Fine, thanks for having me on.
Well, it's your third appearance, so we want to say thanks for joining us again. It's nice to have you back.
Oh, it's always a pleasure.
Huey P. Long, the Kingfish, as he nicknamed himself, was probably Louisiana's most significant politician. He was so different, Donald. He was so uniquely driven. And he had an ideology that really resonated with families who were still feeling the Great Depression so sharply. And the newness of this, to many, shouldn't really be surprising. The country had been dominated by Republicans since Reconstruction, and Coolidge and Hoover had both really been conservatives, and I guess Taft as well. But the median point of normalcy for America in the first 3 decades of the 20th century had really moved to the right. So Long was really something yet unseen in the American political spectrum. So where did he contract his ideology? What and who really inspired him?
Well, I think he came up in the tradition of you had the great populist movement in the 1890s. The Populist Party lasted for a brief while there, and it was a rebellion to what we still see today among too few people, recognizing that what Huey Long called the Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the identical, I call them Republicrats, or Republicans and Democrats. So the Populist Party formed, and it was largely agrarian-based. A lot of farmers felt they were getting a raw deal, and they nominated James Weaver. I believe it was 1892 or 1896, one of those elections, and I think he got 7-8% of the vote or something. But William Jennings Bryan came out of that, as you know, to become the Democratic Party nominee, and he was certainly a populist, a kind of watered-down version of the populist, but still somebody who would be much better than what we have today. And I think Huey Long was inspired by William Jennings Bryan. Definitely. And it's hard to understand exactly what, other than that, really inspired Huey Long, because he didn't necessarily lead a tremendously hard life, and the rest of his family really didn't seem to be as radically oriented as he was. But he was, I believe, inspired by the populace of his day, and hopefully, I believe he had sincere beliefs, where he looked around and he saw the poverty, especially in his state of Louisiana, which was just a huge swamp until he got into office. And he basically paved the state, and, we'll talk a little bit more about what he did for the state, but I think he looked at what was around him, and he genuinely wanted to help people.
Well, actually, he used to tell the fanciful tale that he was raised in a log cabin, when instead he was really raised in quite a large home that was constructed with logs. So not exactly the same as a log cabin, but I guess also understandable for someone who really did want that kinship with the poor. And there's a sort of rich man's guilt that turns into fabrications, and yes, it is usually on the left. But I don't think there really needs to be. I mean, you can care about an issue greatly without having bore the pains of it yourself.
Yeah, and I think we see that on a lot of figures on the left. They try to exaggerate perhaps where they came from. And as you know from Survival of the Richest and my other writings, very few people come from actual rags. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, the log cabin myth there, it's largely a myth. His father was one of the largest landowners in the state. So we just... Harry Truman, they like to say he came from poverty, and he was a Democratic Party candidate Democratic Party delegate to the National Convention as a teenager, and people from poor backgrounds don't get in a position to be named to something like that. So I think this Horatio Alger thing is largely a myth, and Huey Long definitely, I'm sure, he was a great politician. There's no doubt about that. So he may have milked that for what it was worth to try to make it seem as if he had come from these incredibly humble backgrounds, but he really didn't. But I think at least we can focus on what he did as a politician, and that's where all the difference came, because he actually was doing things for the people.
He was, but before he could do things for the people, he had to do something to place himself into that position. So he has an admirable career for quite a young man, 1 year of college, and then he convinces the board to allow him to sit for the bar exam after, again, 1 year of school.
Yeah.
Well, he passes. But at 24, he's too young to run for office, but he is eligible for a seat on the Louisiana Railroad Commission, which is not a bad job in itself. So he wins that in a runoff. What does he do in his legal career and in his time on the commission?
Well, he was a young lawyer, and he said when he began his career, I'm never going to take a case against a poor man. And again, he built his reputation on that, and whether he got some mileage out of that, I don't know. But he was helping people, and he went to bat right away against Standard Oil, especially. It was run by the Rockefellers, and ran Louisiana, and that was his first huge enemy. I mean, if Huey Long had never done anything else, had never been a critic of the Federal Reserve or talked about sharing the wealth or anything, the fact that he went up against Standard Oil so strongly at such a young age, and he had the Rockefellers and all, and he was criticizing the Harrimans and the Barooks and the J.P. Morgans and so forth, the Vanderbilts. He was talking about those, and he was naming them, the 1% of his day. And this is this young whippersnapper that I'm sure they just despised him. And then when he won political office, I mean, one of his when he was elected governor, I mean, one of his first things was to try to put a big tax on crude oil, which affected, again, Standard Oil and the Rockefellers, and that's what led to the first impeachment against him, which I think was 1930. And again, they kept trying to impeach him, and you can see some of his speeches where he kind of, in his great joking style, he'd say, they impeached me in 1930, they tried to impeach me, and, he goes on with a litany of how often they tried to stop him, and unfortunately, eventually they did what George Bernard Shaw, he defined as the most extreme form of censorship when they assassinated him in 1935.
I was elected Railroad Commissioner of Louisiana in 1918, and they tried to impeach me in 1920. When they failed to impeach me in 1920, they indicted me in 1921. And when I wiggled through that, I managed to become governor in 1928. And they impeached me in 1929.
Huey Long was so different, not just from conservatives in the country at the time, but also from liberals. So what was his ideology? What was he specifically trying to do?
Well, he built a movement that swept the nation and had anywhere between 7 and 10 million members, I believe, at the time of his death, called the Shared Wealth Society. And this is in the midst of the Great Depression, and he was began as a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt because Roosevelt ran on some of those same themes, but like so many politicians, he didn't keep his promises, and Huey Long was suspicious right away when he said, you've got people like Bernard Baruch and James Warburg, tied to the birth of the Federal Reserve System. He said, you've got these awful bankers around you, and he knew right away that he smelt a rat there in that administration, and he realized, and he began criticizing Franklin Roosevelt, and he was always his fiercest critic, and he was always his best critic because he had such a brilliant wit. I mean, he made this fantastic speech. I mean, people can access it in lots of places where he made fun of Roosevelt, what he was paid to basically not go to World War I, and Roosevelt, unlike Huey Long, was not. It was like most of the genuine liberals. This is where I delineate in my book and my writing, where you can take people like Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Clarence Darrow, people like Teddy Roosevelt, who are considered progressive. In retrospect, they were always pro-war. They supported every war of their time, every foreign incursion. Huey Long was the real deal. He's like the kind of liberals that we would say today, like a Cynthia McKinney or a Cindy Sheehan or Dennis Kucinich, or myself, who are against war, who are genuinely for peace. Huey Long was against World War I. I believe he probably would have been part of the America First Committee, which was largely consisted of leftists, not rightists, not Nazis, but these were genuine peace people who wanted peace, like John F. Kennedy later would. But Huey Long's ideology, I think, was he wanted to do something for the common man, and unlike Franklin Roosevelt and the liberal establishment of his day and the liberal establishment of our day, he didn't just want to create bureaucracies, and he criticized the alphabet agencies that Roosevelt was creating because he recognized there was a huge middleman there, and who knew exactly how much was dribbling through there. And in fact, very few of those programs actually helped people. It wasn't until the legislation at the end of the decade that was largely because of Huey Long and some other leftists, Eugene Debs and people like that, who really wanted vast reform. Huey Long wanted a 30, maybe 20-hour work week, and that's resulted in a 40-hour work week, which was still wonderful and something we take for granted now. But before that, they could work you as many hours as they wanted, and they could fire you for any reason. Huey Long's pressure caused the legislation which was passed in the late 30s and created the 40-hour work week, the concept of overtime, pensions, sick leave, so forth. But until that time, the average person never took a vacation. After that, people were able to go to the beach once a summer or whatever, and this was a fantastic advance for the masses. And it all came about because of someone like Huey Long, who really, until that time, no one had spoken with such a radical voice and started challenging the concept of the class structure itself. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but what differentiated him from a communist or a socialist is that Huey Long, you can look at any of the Soviet Union or communist China or any country where communism came to power, we don't see any sharing of the wealth. There's no distribution of the wealth. You see an elite at the top, and then you see the masses living in abject poverty, much as we see in all the third world countries today. And that's why I'm so alarmed at what's happening in America today, because I think we're seeing increasingly that, as I write about all the time. We're seeing all the wealth is being driven into the hands of fewer and fewer people, and the rest of the people are being driven down into standards of living that really cannot be accepted in a first world country. And this is the kind of thing Huey Long was ranting about, and in his capacity as governor and then senator of the state of Louisiana, he did everything he could, and the people of Louisiana saw tangible results. What most people don't realize is, unlike a Franklin Roosevelt or later Lyndon Johnson or Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, the liberals of our day, the poor people didn't see any significant increases in the standard of living. In Huey Long's Louisiana, the average family saved over what in today's cost would be over $5,000 in terms of taxes, utility costs, and so forth. And that's just even today. Just imagine saving $5,000 on your living expenses. It's like giving a $5,000 raise from your job. These were tangible results. 80% of the people in Louisiana didn't pay property tax under Huey Long. His phone, he even made it so that Louisiana paid the least amount for phone calls in their phone booths. I mean, he did everything he possibly could. He put free, the first person ever. He built mental institutions instead of prisons for people that were mentally ill and not criminal. He invented the concept of health care and so forth and mental health care for prisoners, and he invented the concept of adult education, free textbooks for children. These are things that all were ideas of Huey Long, and before him they were unheard of. So he had a fantastic legacy, and I just get so tired of listening to people denigrate him as a demagogue and say that he was corrupt. And in fact, he was fighting against corruption, and he was one of the most honest politicians America's ever seen.
Well, we know he was as ambitious as he was innovative, and he runs for the governorship of Louisiana in 1928 at the age of 35. Very young to go for the state house.
Right.
But like we heard him say earlier, they will try to impeach him in 1989. Now, we know he went after the sacred cow of Louisiana, which would be Standard Oil, and which he would call the Invisible Empire, in fact. And he said it was run by petroleumites. I just love those names. I love those names. And it seems like the Rockefellers and their allies were not really as enamored with the Kingfish as the people were. So I'm guessing that was the underlying cause for the impeachment rumblings that began as soon as he took office. But Donald, what was the public reason that was being given?
Well, I think on the surface they were already trying to insinuate that he was a dictator. And that's kind of the litany you hear all the time, that he was ruling with an iron hand, and he basically had this, they called it a deducts box, where he was taking state funds, and I'm not even sure how, it was a very confusing accusation, but it was enough combined with the constant smearing of the press that the enemies of Huey Long had an image of him as this kind of fat cat Southern politician who sat back in his high-price tailor-made suits and ordered the people around him like a dictator. The comparisons were already starting to Hitler. In fact, I have quotes in Survival of the Richest where I believe it was Norman Thomas, the Socialist Party candidate, who compared him to Adolf Hitler, which is ridiculous. Although early comparisons to Hitler weren't so bad. As a lot of people have said, if Adolf Hitler had died in like 1937 or 1938, he'd be considered Germany's greatest leader, because he did enact some tremendous reforms for the German people and built them up from rubble until he started, going down the awful path of invading other countries and so forth and doing what he did. But Huey Long at that time was a strong leader, and what happens is we see this in American society where if someone is a strong leader and they're doing something for the people, they immediately get denigrated as a strong man or a dictator and so forth. But if they're a strong leader like an Abraham Lincoln or a Franklin Roosevelt, then they are commended, because and invariably those leaders are leaders who are strong in terms of suppressing the liberties of the people, all in the name of security, because they're anxious to get us into some kind of wars. Both Lincoln and Roosevelt were. In Huey Long's case, he was using whatever power he had. He was using it for good. He was enacting reforms. As I said, the average family saved over $5,000 in the cost of living because of him. He paved the state, and people could look around them and see tangible results. What we see today in America with the crumbling infrastructure and the promises Donald Trump made originally about trying to rebuild it, an infrastructure that has been untouched, basically, for over 50 years. I mean, really since the Eisenhower years when we built the interstate highway system. That's the last great infrastructure rebuild America had. Well, Huey Long was looking at a state that had no infrastructure. It was a big swamp. So the masses around him saw, they saw big buildings rising up. They saw pavement everywhere. They saw hospitals and institutions and free health clinics and so forth being built up around them. They saw free textbooks for their children, and they could go back to school themselves and learn at night under adult education. So these were tangible results. And we can't even American it. Just think of it today. If we saw tangible results, so we started looking around and we saw, wow, we've got updated power grids, so we don't have to worry about the power going out again if there's a strong wind. We've got Wi-Fi everywhere, that kind of thing. The stuff that we should have. We shouldn't be having these massive potholes. They should have technology now where the roads should be built better so that they don't crumble at the signs of a first snowfall. We should probably have heated highways at this point so we don't have to worry about it. But we haven't made any advances, and there isn't a Huey Long out there talking about this stuff. If Huey Long was around today, I think that's the kind of stuff he would be doing. He would be certainly be pointing at the awful nature of our infrastructure, and he would be trying to do something about it.
The Democratic Party and the Republican Party was just like the old patent medicine drummer that used to come around our country. He had 2 bottles of medicine. He'd play a banjo and he'd sell 2 bottles of medicine. One of those bottles of medicine was called hypopylorum. And another one of those bottles of medicine was called lopapahirum. Finally, somebody around there said, is there any difference in these medicines? Oh, he said, considerable. They're both good, but they're different. He said that hypopylorum is made from the bark off the tree that we take from the top down. And that lopapahirum is made from the bark that we take from the root up. And the only difference that I found between the Democratic leadership and the Republican leadership was that one of them was skinning from the ankle up and the other one from the ear down when I got to Congress.
Okay, Donald, hypopylorum and lopapahirum.
Right.
What a great way to explain the farce that is the two-party system in America.
Well, it was a great little country, colorful expression. I never heard it Huey Long. He said one skins you from the feet up, and the other one skins you from the ear down. That was basically how he would explain it. So he was showing the same thing with Tweedledum and Tweedledee, where he was trying to show that the Republican and Democratic parties were identical. They just had a basically cosmetic difference. One skins you from the top down, the other skins you from the bottom up. So that was, and I think people realized even then, and certainly today, imagine with really there are cosmetic differences in the parties, but it's the same kind of thing today. Huey Long would be aghast at our so-called choices because both parties then and now were for war all the time. We're for the big corporations and the powerful interests, the banks, all the time. And this guy, he fought against all these people. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt paid lip service to, we've heard today that he was an enemy to his class because, like almost all the politicians, he came from great wealth. Well, he wasn't an enemy. If he had been an enemy of his great class, he wouldn't have had someone like Bernard Baruch or someone like James Warburg sitting around him in his brain trust. And this is the same way we look at even today. You look at what somebody does. Donald Trump talks about has had such great rhetoric, but you look at his work. He certainly isn't about to become a peace candidate when he names some psychotic guy like John Bolton to his cabinet. So we have to look at who's around them, and I think that's very indicative of what someone means. But this is a guy that wrote the book My First Days in the White House, and was published posthumously. But to show what kind of person Huey Long would have been, unlike the liberals of his day who supported war, he had his fictitious cabinet listed in his book, and his Secretary of War was General Smedley Butler, who wrote the classic War is a Racket, and is one of the greatest anti-war activists of all time. He's revered, certainly in the conspiracy community, where Huey Long isn't. And Smedley. So you know how much war would have happened in a Huey Long administration if Smedley Butler was the Secretary of War. There wouldn't have been any war. And Smedley Butler considered it. He wrote afterwards that he considered that the greatest honor of his life when Huey Long named him the Secretary of War in his book. And he also said that all my interest in politics died with Huey Long. And people don't recognize that about Smedley Butler, but in contrast, Huey Long basically demoted and humiliated Franklin Roosevelt in his book by demoting him back to Secretary of Navy, which was what he had been during World War I. So this is why I think many reasons why Huey Long was despised so much, because he was bold in doing those things. He had no respect for the authority of an FDR. He recognized he was corrupt, like all these guys were. And when he first went to the Senate, he had no respect for Joe Robinson, the majority leader, as a fellow Democrat, where he, very early on in his career, he read into the congressional record a list of all Robinson's corporate sponsors. And then he just kind of said something like, now, I'm not going to suggest that all these people have any influence on Mr. Robinson or anything like that. And his style was so brilliant that, and you imagine what these guys thought of this young kid coming in off the street like that, who was already getting, I think, 60,000 letters a week or some ridiculous amount, more letters, more mail, more fan mail than any U.S. senator had ever received or has received since. You had people flocking to the Capitol to watch him speak back in the days when the Congress was more open and more democratic and people could come off the street and actually come in and witness our proceedings. You had people coming just to watch him. He was that interesting. But he was he definitely ticked off all of the people in his party and the other party, and that's why trying to figure out exactly who would have plotted his assassination is not an easy thing because he had lots and lots of powerful enemies.
And speaking of Long's growing list of enemies, let's listen to a newsreel from the era. Now, you'll hear a certain bias in the wording, so pay attention to that. It runs about 6 minutes, but I think it's illustrative of the mainstream media even then, believing that they are unbiased, yet not being able to help themselves. Does that sound familiar? Here it is.
Almost like a foreign city in the midst of America is New Orleans. Of another world are its Mardi Gras, its river levees, its picturesque alleys, its easy-going, peaceful life. And this old world city, in fact the entire state of Louisiana, is in the grip of a decidedly un-American dictatorship of the loudest character the national political scene has heard in a generation. Long is the name, and long is the way this unusual man has come in the last 7 years. A year later, he was impeached by Louisiana's House of Representatives on 19 assorted charges, from corruption to gross misconduct. But he already controlled the state Senate, and he wriggled out of the impeachment to become a minor national figure, rowdy and vivid. From 1928 on, his doings are news. When the German cruiser Emden visits New Orleans, its commander calls formally on Louisiana's governor. Huey Long's informal reception brings a demand for an official apology. Next day, in dress clothes borrowed piece by piece from friends, he returns the call and receives the governor's salute. Frankly a demagogue, he had been elected through his appeal to the people up the bayou. He promised and he gave them new roads, free bridges instead of toll bridges, a new state capitol, and to himself a new governor's mansion, upping the state's debt 300%, but giving jobs to thousands who will vote for Huey Long. Great fun has the self-styled Kingfish in running Louisiana. With rare self-consciousness, he accepts an honorary doctorate of law from Loyola University. His pretty typist he makes Secretary of State and lets her run Louisiana when he is away.
As the First Lady Governor of Louisiana, I want to take this opportunity to thank my many friends for...
In 1932, Huey Long has himself elected to the United States Senate.
I'm very proud to be here tonight and know it is the proudest moment of my husband's career.
Well, it's been a great evening.
Says the newly elected senator, I've done all I can for Louisiana. Now I want to help the rest of the country. Louisiana's Kingfish graduates to the national political stage, is greeted in Washington by Democratic Senate leader Joseph T. Robinson.
Thank you, Senator Robinson. I'm certainly glad to be with you.
To run his state, Dictator Long puts in O.K. Allen, his good-natured henchman, now puppet governor of Louisiana.
I, Oscar Kelly Allen.
To his new friends in Washington, Huey boasts that back in Louisiana, he has the best legislature money can buy. But away from home, Huey's rowdiness is not so well received. At a Long Island club in August 1933, his senatorial immunity is no help to him. A medal paid for by public subscription memorializes the national black eye of the Kingfish from Louisiana. But Huey Long has come a long way from the washroom of 1933. Popular response to his Share the Wealth movement floods his space in the Senate office building.
Hello. What I called you about was to see if there's any chance of my getting anywhere at all to get a little more space around here temporarily. I don't know what to do. I'll put these people out in the hall and let these senators fuss and probably want to throw us all out of here. I don't know what we're going to do with it because we've got more than we can handle. I'm going to give up this office to the stenographers and move out to some place around the hotel. I wish you'd let me know.
And now the Louisiana Kingfish, having grown too big for Louisiana, too big for the U.S. Senate, eyes the biggest office in the country, the executive office at the White House. Today, Huey Long is the biggest single threat to the re-election of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Share the wealth he promises in specific terms. $5,000 a year, and every man a king.
Mr. Moore, $5,000. For $5 million to anyone man.
Thus, Huey Long revamps for his candidacy of 1936 the broad doctrine of social justice propounded by the candidate of 1932.
Men and women forgotten in the political philosophy of the government of the last 12 years look to us here for guidance and for a more equitable opportunity to share in the distribution of national wealth.
Now, Donald, even before Long attempts to go national, so to speak, he's already been battered and bruised by this viper's pit that is state politics, especially in the South and especially in Louisiana. Yet, rather than taking his lumps and going home and practicing law, he decides that his next step is Washington, D.C. Now, he runs for the U.S. Senate in 1930, just a year after the Great Depression really hits America, and Long defeats an incumbent Senator, Joseph Ransdell. Now, it's customary for the new class of senators to take some time and learn procedure and, in essence, pay some political dues. But not Huey Long.
Yeah.
He almost instantly shares oratorical salvos with both Senate Democratic leader Joe Robinson and the President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Why?
Well, I think he was bold, he was audacious, and he had huge, for somebody to start out as young as he did, he envisioned early on, I think he wanted to be president, he wanted to go right to the top, and he also had, as they called Huey Long always, he was defined as a man in a hurry. And you can look at his whole career, he was a man in a hurry. He was on, overdrive. And so he had very little patience with the decorum of the Senate or anything else. He wanted to get things done. So he would not have lasted on Capitol Hill any period of time because he did not have the patience for party politics, and he didn't have the patience in general. He saw all the things that needed to be done. Let's do it. Let's do it now. And he, these old, crusty senators that have been up on the Hill for a long time and were into their own traditional ways and decorum and so forth, they had never seen anything like a Huey Long. Again, before Huey Long came, there was this fantastic decorum, and basically after Huey Long, with very few exceptions, almost anybody that goes into Congress, especially in the Senate, which is considered the more revered, the upper body of Congress, so that the real traditional people go there. There's this my distinguished colleague, my esteemed colleague, even when you're supposedly opposed to them in politics. Huey Long wasn't going to do that. Instead, I'm reading out a list of my party's leader. These are the people that are sponsoring him, and he's humiliating him on the first day, or not the first day, but right as soon as he got there. So he wasn't interested in making a first impression. He wasn't out to win friends and influence people. Huey Long he recognized the kind of corruption was there at the top, and he realized that I can't work with these people. He realized, how am I going to work with the Joe Robinsons? And early on, he recognized I can't work with Franklin Roosevelt. He's being advised by people like Bernard Baruch. So and we would recognize today, like if people think, okay, we can do something about Trump, well, Trump's being advised by the likes of John Bolton and these kind of people who are Goldman Sachs executives and so forth. So you realize it's hard to get through to somebody, and that somebody's not really going to be any kind of a reformer if those are the people that have his ear, that have his, that are around him and giving him advice more often than anyone else. So Huey Long recognized that the corruption was there, and so he immediately started going after Roosevelt, and that's why Roosevelt called him one of the two most dangerous men in America. The other was Douglas MacArthur.
Right, and you can tell that they really dislike him from day one because he's unable to pass any legislation.
Right. Not a single piece of legislation.
Not one piece. But Huey Long was from the South, and it was the 1930s. So what were his views on race?
Well, unlike all the other, he opposed the Ku Klux Klan, and this was in the Ku Klux Klan. Unlike today, when it's really just an embarrassing small organization, it has no power at all whatsoever. It's a very watered down version of what it maybe once was. But during the 1920s and 1930s, The Klan had millions of members across the country, including people like Hugo Black, who would go on to become a Supreme Court justice, nominated by the great liberal Harry Truman. People like Robert Byrd, who went on to serve in the Senate as a so-called establishment liberal Democrat for decades. But their past is never brought up. Huey Long opposed the Klan, and he never played racial politics. And I have the quotes from him in the book where, any man, if a black man, should be given the same chance as anyone else. This was a revolutionary opinion for a Southern politician of the time, really for any opinion. He was great on race in retrospect, looking at through our modern prism, as opposed to virtually anyone back then. I have quotes in the book, actually it'll probably be in the upcoming what was going to be Hidden History too. It's been retitled, but I have a lot more about Roosevelt and so forth in that book, and I have a lot of these quotes on these esteemed liberals that can be considered tremendously racist, from Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, back to Abraham Lincoln, FDR himself. But Huey Long, you can't find a racist quote on the record, and believe me, if it existed, his enemies in the press, which are everywhere, would have been publicizing it. There is no quote you can find that even hints at a tone of racism in Huey Long.
Well, yes, he was absolutely a man ahead of his time, but that could also be said about healthcare, could it not?
Yeah, he was basically advocating a form of universal health care back then, and his state, I think he showed the way that it should be done or could be done in America with the way he did it in Louisiana, where he just built a bunch of free health care clinics for the poor, the people that couldn't afford it. And I think that's the way you would have to go in America. We need free healthcare, good healthcare clinics all across America where people can get basic healthcare. If they want something better, then they can pay for it and go through the insurance companies and so forth. I think that's the way Huey Long was already recognizing the problem was back then. But he recognized that people like that there were mental patients and mental illness, which was just really being recognized, and it didn't make any sense to be throwing them in prisons. It was cruel. And so he built mental institutions, and he had mental health care for prisoners, which had never been even suggested before. So he was a revolutionary figure in so many respects, but I think his basic premise was that things are wrong. There's too much power in the hands of too few people, and there's too many people that are suffering. And he did things unlike any other liberal politician I can find in American history. He did more for people, for poor people, and for average people than all the other liberal politicians put together in a very short period of time.
And I'm sure there are some who think, well, he must have had allies, and other than FDR, who's personally having his power challenged at this point, he must have been popular with those on his own side of the aisle, and he must have even been popular with, say, the American Communist Party or the New York Times.
No, absolutely not. And I have the New York Times published an awful obituary on him, which they actually claimed it was time to be kind to him, but it was a terrible obituary. It just raked him over the coals and denigrated him. I have quotes issued in the wake of his death by both the American Communist Party and the American Socialist Party that show that neither one of them had any love for him, and that makes no sense because on the surface of it, he was doing something they should have loved, but that gives the game away. That's why there's a difference between Huey Long was a populist, and he was definitely not a communist or socialist. On the surface, it sounds the same. Let's have a redistribution of wealth. But he recognized that our crony capitalist system was unfair. It wasn't free enterprise, and so there wasn't a level playing field. So he recognized that the only avenue available to the people to get any kind of redress is through the government. And it's so ironic that we have so many people that, especially on the left, that want the government to be involved in everything, that want to start programs here or there, that want to control every aspect of your lives. They won't go after the bread and butter issue, which, let's look at these tax-free foundations. Let's look at how much money is hidden offshore. Let's find out where all that wealth is, considering that 50% of the people, the bottom half of America now, is making less than $27,000 a year, which is nothing these days. It's not enough to afford an apartment, and that same 50% has less than 1% of the collective wealth. So if half the country has nothing, then where is that wealth? And we know that the middle class is shrinking and shrinking even further, so that basically you have 1% at the top has so much. 1% of the 1% has an unfathomable amount. You have to go after that, but that's where establishment liberals don't want to do, because so many of them are 1%ers. They don't want anybody coming after their wealth. And the Rockefellers are certainly never going to advocate for that. although ostensibly they're advocating liberal policies, but they're not actual liberal policies. And that's why you see institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and things, now the Bill Gates Foundation, they will, on the surface, look like they're promoting good causes, liberal causes. But if you scratch beneath it, you'll see that, first of all, where is this funding coming from, and what are the real purposes? In my upcoming book, I'm going to have a lot about the Norman Dodd, the investigator of the committee that investigated tax-free foundations in the 50s. And one of the things they investigated was the Carnegie Foundation for International Peace. And I don't have it in front of me now, but it's unbelievable, some of the quotes where they're quotes right out of their handbook, talking about how to extend World War I, and basically how to foment war. And this is a foundation so-called dedicated to international peace. That's what we have to fight, and that's the kind of thing that Huey Long would have never been a party to. I mean, I don't know that he knew that, but that's why he was early on recognized the Federal Reserve was corrupt, and he was one of the first critics of it. You look at something like back then in the 1920s, and again, I discuss so much of this in my upcoming book, but I scratched on a little bit in Survival of the Richest in the chapter on Huey Long. You had the World War I Army that had been promised a bonus, and they had a huge march on Washington, D.C., and in a tremendous show of force, and it was actually had a negative impact, big impact on Herbert Hoover. The president, he unfortunately unleashed this army. It was led by future heroes George Patton and Douglas MacArthur to quash these, and it was just an awful show of force to stop these veterans who were largely homeless and who'd been promised something they weren't given. Well, Franklin Roosevelt, as a young politician then, opposed the bonus army getting their bonus. And that was the liberal establishment view of his day. People like Smedley Butler and Huey Long were strong proponents of them getting the bonus. They thought this was an outrage. And that's the difference on issues like that. You see where an FDR and the establishment liberals would come down, and where a guy like Huey Long or a Smedley Butler would come down.
Right, and I think that quite often that's really the problem of using this sort of linear political spectrum anyway. Left isn't always left, and right isn't always right, and really, in the end, what does it all mean anyway? But the time that Long would have to enact any of these on a national scale would be very limited, because on August 9th, 1935, he makes an incredible speech. And really, it's a sad bit of foreshadowing, because he knew something was afoot. What does he say?
Well, he basically goes on the floor of the Senate and describes a brewing plot to assassinate him. And he does all but finger the Roosevelt administration as at least being sympathetic to it. Much as 9/11 critics would later say, at the very least, the Bush administration stood down on 9/11. And that's basically what he was saying. He didn't necessarily say Roosevelt's trying to plot to kill me, but reading between the lines, that's the inference I got. But there were powerful figures, certainly, that he knew. And later on, I discussed in the book about how the Ken Burns documentary interviewed people like I.F. Stone, who was a big-time, again, another establishment liberal journalist. But on the subject of Huey Long, he despised him, and he talks about being happy that he was assassinated. And I.F. Stone, again, and we look at how the liberal establishment works as opposed to these radicals, I.F. Stone would also be one of the biggest cover-up artists in the JFK assassination. Like so much of the establishment left, he smeared the original critics like Mark Lane of the Warren Commission and constantly stood behind the fairy tale that Oswald killed Kennedy. These are like calling cards you can see. If someone is really an actual classical liberal who was fighting for reform, like a Huey Long was, and a guy like I.F. Stone, or Harding Carter. Harding Carter III would be Jimmy Carter's press secretary. His father, and again, these guys always come from wealth and come from establishment. He built nothing. His father was a huge newspaper power publisher back in Louisiana, and one of Huey Long's biggest enemies. Well, Harding Carter II's widow can be seen in this Ken Burns documentary over and over again. And the hatred she still has for Huey Long, she can't hide it. And she talks at one point about nearly every Saturday night we would get together and discuss who's going to kill him. And said, now that sounds awful, I know, but we did. And that's the kind of they wanted Huey Long dead so badly because, and again, they tried to impeach him, they tried to smear him in the press, but he always had support from the poor. And again, he had the black and white poor, and to this day, I understand you can go in some of the poor communities of Louisiana, and they'll have a picture hanging up of him in his house next to Jesus or maybe JFK or whatever. But they'll have a picture of Huey Long because he was a hero to the poor people. They recognized this was the first guy that ever cared about us, that did something to improve our lives. It didn't just pay lip service and create some agency where we ended up getting no aid at all out of it, but you just had a bunch of unnecessary government workers administrating a plan that wasn't good enough to help anyone, and just create another big bureaucracy.
Well, that's correct. And unfortunately for America, and unfortunately for Huey Long, 4 weeks later, he would be dead. And I want to simply start this part of the discussion by asking you, who is Carl Weiss?
Well, Carl Weiss was the patsy, I believe the patsy. He was a young doctor, and the official narrative goes that he was so mad, he was so fired up about his father. His father was one of Huey Long's many opponents in Louisiana. Again, the state was divided, basically, where Huey Long was such a divisive figure. Think of like Trump on steroids, where so half the state really despised him, and the other half loved him. Weiss's father didn't love him, and he supposedly was so mad about this that he decided to go down to the State House and confront him with a gun. Now, I have in the book, there was a big figure in the Louisiana State Police that decades later would confess, who would basically say that, I was told by the people at the scene that they planted the gun on Weiss at the scene after they shot him. And this is a big state police official, and that's the kind of thing that 60 Minutes should have gone after, or investigative pieces, but because we don't have investigative journalists in this country, obviously it just got swept under the rug, and it appears on, in the books by people like me. But I don't think there's any question that Weiss was blown away at the scene. He was shot at least 30 times by Long's bodyguards. I can't begin to understand the actual logistics of what happened. A lot of theories hold that Long had at least a couple bodyguards that were on the payroll and were tasked to assassinate him. How Carl Weiss was steered into that position, I don't know. But his body was found at the scene with an unlimited number of bullet holes in it, and as I said, a state police official admitted that he had a couple of the police at the scene talked about how they planted the gun on him.
We're talking to Donald Jeffries, the author of Hidden History and Survival of the Richest. We have links to both on MidnightRiderNews.com. So, Donald, I'd like to discuss the FDR angle here. Do you think there was any foreknowledge, any passive or active acknowledgement, or any sort of nodding of the head regarding Long's assassination, at least where the White House was concerned?
Well, I think FDR was a typical cunning psychopath, politician, and yeah, I certainly don't think he would have been above doing that. So yeah, I think he wanted FDR, he wanted Huey Long assassinated. There's no question about that. Whether we can look later in the future, like when people talk about LBJ being behind JFK's assassination. I don't know that the decisions get made at that level. I think a decision to knock off a figure like that is probably made even above FDR. But certainly I think FDR knew about it. At the very least, he approved of it, and he certainly benefited from it. But FDR, we know, I have in the upcoming book, I'll have a little bit of a body count for him. Again, it's harder to find the body counts on these guys going that far back, but he had some of his critics that died unnaturally as well, and certainly I will tell the story of how he engineered us into World War II, and I don't think he minded sacrificing all the people that died at Pearl Harbor to do that.
Well, you tell a fascinating story in the book about meetings taking place in Louisiana, meetings specifically about the killing of Huey Long.
Yeah, exactly. And I was contacted by one of the guys that's still alive to this day, and he verified it. Yeah, he went, and the story he tells is incredible. And again, it's all in the chapter on Huey Long and Survival of the Richest. But he basically sets something out of a movie where he talks about having a hood placed on him and whisked away to a secret location, and all these powerful lawyers and doctors and politicians, these powerful figures that are there, bankers, and they're plotting to assassinate Huey Long. It almost reads again like some kind of a mystery novel or something, but it was very real. And again, this guy at an advanced age has no reason to. Why would he lie about that? He's telling somebody like me that he's not writing a book and getting lots of money from it or something. So I think that there's no question that there was a lot there to investigate, but as I point out, there really wasn't any kind of an investigative piece done on the Huey Long assassination until I believe I don't think there's ever been the kind of expose that I would like to write if I had the time and there was enough information out there, because I think that there's no question that the official story is just, if you look at what happened, apparently Huey Long's wounds weren't really serious, and that he was basically killed by his doctors. And it was a very open procedure, but you had one of the surgeons was one of the most virulent anti-Long activists in the state, and he had made comments about, if I put Huey Long under anesthesia, he's not coming out, things like that. But although to his credit, he did warn everybody there, look, watch everything I do. But again, why was he there? And apparently one of the guys Huey Long called for, because Huey Long was conscious at first, one of the doctors he wanted there was involved in a very convenient accident on the way, so that delayed him getting there. But we know they never produced, there was no inquest really ever held. They never produced the bullet that killed him. There was no autopsy done, and I'll discuss in the next book. It shocked even me. I mean, it's unbelievable how these most powerful figures in America die, and there are no autopsies done. And this goes back, to Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge and FDR himself. No autopsies done. It's very weird, but in something like Huey Long, where he was assassinated, how you don't have an autopsy is mind-boggling. But they didn't, and there was really no hearing done. And Huey Long's one of his top lieutenants was a guy named Gerald L.K. Smith, who unfortunately became a really far right-wing, anti-Semitic, kind of racist guy later in his life. But he also was one of the few people that was carrying Huey Long's mantle. So I'm not sure how that corresponded with Huey Long's, and whether Huey Long might have drifted to the far right. I have no way of knowing. But Gerald L.K. Smith certainly did. But one of his charges was that he claimed a lot of things about FDR, but he claimed that FDR personally squelched the desire for, on some parts of Congress or whatever, to have an independent investigation into the Long assassination, and that he claimed that Roosevelt himself personally stopped that. Whether that's true, I don't know, but however you look at it, it was a pathetic attempt at investigation, and this very controversial figure who had said some of the most revolutionary things any American political figure ever has was assassinated a month after he predicted that he would be on the Senate floor.
You and I have talked before about this, and if anyone would like to hear more, they can listen to both of our episodes for free. But Survival of the Richest, to me, is largely about the division between rich and poor. But it's not a statistics book. Now, it's also about this bizarre acceptance of a worsening structure by the people. And it's become so common to defend the rich, defend extreme capitalism, to defend the idea that greed is good, to quote Michael Douglas in Wall Street, to defend the unethical and immoral practices that, at least in part, fuel this system. The bottom is defending the top, as the top intentionally rigs the system to keep the bottom at the bottom. Donald, it's unbelievable. Yeah. So in this world, I'm trying to imagine what Huey Long, or what a Huey Long, would even look like.
Well, I think Huey Long would be a superstar in the terms of media. I mean, he was so savvy, and he was such a captivating speaker. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt was a great speaker himself, but Huey Long was better. If they had debated, he would have been one of the few people that could have made a fool out of Roosevelt. He was that brilliant. And William Howard Taft, who was the only president ever to go from president to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, when Huey Long spoke before the Supreme Court at a very young age, he later said that he was the most brilliant speaker that has ever spoken before the Supreme Court. And this was as a young man. Huey Long was incredible. He could speak in a southern dialect and sound like one of the good old boys as he was eating at a barbecue, and then he could speak the most brilliant Ivy League educated vernacular you could imagine when the situation called for it. He was a fantastic politician. I think he had sincere beliefs. I certainly hope he did. I think he really wanted to help people. So you would have to think he would be out on the fringes somewhere. Now, whether he would have gravitated to the right, it's possible he would have, because there's so much that happened after his death in terms of World War II and the Korean War, Vietnam War, and so forth. The massive growth of government and some of the social policies that push us into the social justice warrior areas. I don't know how he would have felt about that, but I think that his bread and butter issue, the distribution of wealth, is certainly as bad today as it was then, if not worse. So I think he would have been hopefully would have liked my book. Maybe he would have written a blurb for it, hopefully. But I think he would have been the biggest kind of he would have been, think Bernie Sanders times $1 million. Plus, he would have been, unlike Bernie Sanders, he would have been, I think, genuinely anti-war and anti-banks and so forth. I think he would have been aghast at the power of the Federal Reserve. I think he would have been going nuts over every administration having tons of Goldman Sachs and other banking officials in there that are being, and certainly something like the banker bailout. I can't imagine what he would have done with something like that when you had these people giving themselves 6 of the 9 banks, I think, that were bailed out, gave them their executives more in bonuses that year than the company made in profits. So which is not exactly a good business model, but Huey Long would have had a field day with the politics today. I don't know where he would have stood, but I think hopefully it would have been something like me. I think he just would have been a populist that was far left on most things, but hated the establishment liberals as I do, and would have been far right on some other issues.
How did you become so interested in the life and career of Huey Long?
Oh, I remember as a little kid, for some reason, and I really don't know why, at a very young age, I had this radical streak in me where I just kind of, and I grew up in kind of a lower middle class household. I mean, we didn't really want for anything, but we certainly didn't have money.
Oh, same here.
I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, I felt secure though. And again, I grew up in the tail end of the baby boomer era, so that was when we had our highest standard of living ever. And really, every family had felt, no one ever felt like they were going to be thrown out of the street. I don't think, at least I didn't. But I recognized that we didn't have a lot of stuff, but I remember just reading about Huey Long. I read all the time. I was constantly reading, and something about him appealed to me because that share the wealth, that just kind of elicited a little spark of interest in me at a very young age, because I kind of recognized, well, why should so many people have these, castles they go to once a year and own their own islands and all this crazy stuff we see that the 1% of the 1% has, and the fact that there's still poor people anywhere, that makes no sense. And so I didn't see anybody else I recognized even early on as a huge student of history. I mean, I read history books from the time I was very young, and I wasn't sophisticated enough yet to know how much they were lying to us, the court historians were, but just on the surface of it, I recognized, wow, this Huey Long was really unique. There was nobody before him that seemed to talk about that stuff, and there hasn't, even at that time in the 60s where you had the radicals talking about the war on poverty and so forth, there was nobody talking about it with Huey Long. Nobody was talking about stripping the foundations of their tax-free status and uncovering their wealth to find out how much money was in there and what was being used for. No one was talking about capping fortunes. No one was talking about the kind of stuff that Huey Long, that everyone deserves at least the essential means of existence, as Huey Long did. So, something about him appealed to me, and I really don't know why, other than I said, I from the time I was a very small child, I had this interest, this keen interest, and really kind of a prejudice against the rich. I admit I kind of always held some kind of hostility for the very, very wealthy, and I've never understood that. I mean, certainly we all want to be rich, I guess, so it's kind of a catch-22, but I just recognize that there was something inherently wrong about so few people having so much and so many people having so little.
Well, I think commonly the middle-class workers on the right sort of defend the rich by saying, well, they earned it, they worked for it. But you explain very well in Survival of the Richest that that's not always the case.
No, it very seldom is, really. When you look at these things, you have a few, I don't know if the original John D. Rockefeller Sr., maybe he built something, but I also don't know how many times, I don't know his story, but I think he may have been like some of those oil men where he just got lucky and oil was discovered on his property. So I'm not positive about that, so don't hold me to that, but if any of these guys built it, it was generations ago, and anybody in charge today, whether it's the Walton children, down to Bill Gates, who was not a middle-class guy. His father was president of Planned Parenthood, and his mother was hugely connected with tons of very important people. Way back in the 50s, when most mothers were staying at home, like June Cleaver, and baking cookies and cleaning house, his mother was sitting on the boards of directors at powerful banks and people like that. And Gates' grandfather was the president of a bank. So he didn't come from, they keep this myth up that he came from middle class. That's not the middle class I grew up as. I was in a completely different middle class. Well, and that's another, what happens, I think, too, is that the establishment extends the definition of middle class to people like myself and maybe you, who grew up, who again we didn't want for anything, but to Bill Gates, whose father was president of Planned Parenthood. I mean, and his mother was sitting in the boards of directors and so forth of everything.
So I recently saw this story, and I thought, what a great thing to bring up to my friend Donald Jeffries. And apparently the Walton family have decided to give Walmart employees a bit of a raise. Here it's about $3 an hour, so that the starting pay is now $11 an hour. But they're also firing or involuntarily retiring assistant managers and department heads who've worked decades with the company. So employee cuts continue to pay for employee raises. Now, rather than a company-wide redistribution of wealth, what Walmart is doing in essence, they're impoverishing the higher lower class to slightly raise up the lower class. Yeah. It's really a disgusting practice, the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly, and it happens. It happens, and then they have layoffs, and this is all part, I think, of the propaganda campaign where maybe Donald Trump is getting a little payback in terms of public relations because of his tax cut, because he cut the corporate tax rate, and the idea from the right was that once this happens, you're going to see they're going to, for the first time in the history of the world, these rich people are going to actually return some of the savings they're getting to the masses, and we know it never works out that way. They may help their investors, in terms of that, where they'll give them a little reward, but to the actual people, and it's so interesting where you hear. I read these debates on the conspiracy forums, and that's really the only place you can get any debate, but it's hilarious when you listen to whether it's McDonald's or any other corporation talk about, we can't possibly raise the pay rate of our lowest worker. We can't raise the minimum wage. We can't give somebody $15 an hour. Otherwise, you'll be paying so much for the products. Well, how come the products never go up when you give a CEO a $40 million golden umbrella, or you pay these massive, but somehow that doesn't affect the price of your products. But if you give the lowest wage worker something, somehow that will. And one of my new talking points, I'd met somebody who's a friend of mine who worked at Safeway back in the early 1980s. He was making $17 an hour as a cashier back in the 1980s at Safeway. That translated to $35,000 a year. If you take that $35,000 a year in today's terms, it's over $112,000. Grocery store cashier, that same company, Safeway, still in existence, same position, pays under $10 an hour now. So just that, I can't think of a better. I also use the example of Circuit City. It's a big chain, electronics chain. Back in the 1980s, I knew several people. And in fact, I almost took a job there myself. The salesmen were routinely making in the mid-30s just because of the commissions. Again, you're talking about well over $100,000 in today's terms. Now, that company went out of business, but the Best Buys and so forth, again, they're paying their people. They don't pay commissions anymore. They're paying them, 10, maybe the Geek Squad makes $12, $13 an hour. I don't know if they're there a while. But that's the kind of difference, and that's where the difference between me and I hope, I'm not flattering myself, but I think if Huey Long was alive today, those are the kind of things he'd be focusing on, where you don't hear anybody on the left, anybody on the left talking about criticizing Safeway or any other company like that. Wait a minute, how could you, and again, it gets back to the price of the product will go up. Well, food back in the 1980s was much cheaper than it is now. So how could they possibly have paid their cashiers this kind of really fantastic middle-class wage back then? The products were cheaper, so again, you see people were making more, and the cost of living was cheaper. How can that possibly be in this so-called marketplace that is tied inevitably, they claim, to the vagaries of the cost of living, whatever the product is, this is going to go up in conjunction with that? Well, it didn't work that way. It didn't work that way for Circuit City, Safeway. Those are just two examples I know of myself. I'm sure there were lots of other places like that too, because Safeway had a strong union back then, and they weren't the only company that had a strong union, and that resulted, of course, in people having a much higher salary, much better benefits. I also talk about, just recently I've learned in my family, as we talk in, behind closed doors, and just in my experiences about the subject matter of Survival of the Richest, my newest book, but we talk about things like, I've learned one of my cousins when her husband had a job it was a decent job, but it was, kind of a fairly solid middle class job, but nothing special. But when he retired, part of his package was free health care for life. When he died, which he did, my cousin's still alive, is still getting as his spouse free health care for life. Think of that incredible benefit. My sister has a neighbor across the street, and definitely lower middle class. When he retired again from not a special job, free health care for life, and that includes his spouse. So I know two people that are enjoying a benefit that we can't even fathom in today's world. And they weren't special jobs. They were just, fairly lower middle class jobs, and this was not anything uncommon for that time period. You're just seeing fewer and fewer people, because they're obviously much older, that are still surviving, and no one questions that. I question, okay, what happened? Why? How are we able to do it then and we can't do it now? And I think the answer is obvious, because you didn't have the incredible greed at the top. The CEOs, the presidents of these companies did not grab, as Huey Long would say, all the grub for themselves. They actually let some of it go down, and they took the advice of Henry Ford, who famously said, I have to give my workers a raise because I have to pay them enough to be able to afford the product that I'm building. But apparently, people that run corporations today don't seem to think of that, and their only goal seems to be, how big is my bonus going to be? How much can I pad my pocket before I get a golden umbrella or whatever, and go on to the next company to loot them?
Very, very well said. And I was happy to hear that we have a new release this fall.
Well, it's actually, I think it's going to be next spring, but it was originally going to be Hidden History 2, the prequel. For some reason, they didn't like that title, so I think the official title is going to be Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, 1776 to 1963.
Fantastic, and I must say, it's about time, Donald.
Well, it's been a while, so yeah, I'm looking forward to it, because I've certainly been out there for a while.
And as a fan of Hidden History 1, I'm obviously excited, as you know. And you know that you have an open door policy here, so anytime you want to talk, we'll always be here for you. But before that happens, we're planning to have you back on to talk about the death of JFK Jr. Interesting
Wonderful.
Story. And now, because you're also very knowledgeable on true crime issues, we're also sort of discussing and planning an episode where we'll talk about Elizabeth Smart, JonBenet Ramsey, Natalie Holloway, and Chandra Levy, among others. So I'll keep everyone apprised on when that will be. But for now, where can people follow you online?
Well, they can. I blog regularly. My blog is called Keeping It Unreal, after my 2007 novel, The Unreals, and it's donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. I'm easy to find, and I hopefully my book on bullying and the social hierarchy, I think that's going to be released next year as well. I'm deciding whether to go with this other publisher or not, but basically he's already published it, so I may have two books coming out next year. So hopefully, we'll have a lot more to discuss, but people can, they can find my books, Hidden History and Survival of the Richest, on Amazon, and they're in most Barnes & Noble stores. I'm easy to find. If you Google me, you can find my writings pretty easily.
This has been Donald Jeffries, the author of Hidden History and Survival of the Richest. Buy those books. Hey, Donald, thank you very much for being on tonight.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I always enjoy it.
I'm S.T. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back.
This is Scott Greenberger, the author of The Unexpected President, The Life and Times of Chester A. Arthur. For more on the amazing yet unexpected rise of one of America's most unlikely presidents, listen to episode 42 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
And before the final comments tonight, I'd like to play a song for you by Louis Ludwig. It's called Thank God and Huey Long.
Farmer's got to go to work from sunup to sundown. Then he's got to load 'em up and get his crop to town. He's alright, he's got a brand new road he's driving on. He can thank God and Huey Long. Junior's got to go to school to learn to read and write. Daddy only had a slate to get his letters right. Junior's got a school book that can teach him right from wrong. He can thank God and Huey Long. Huey is the man who says that we should share the wealth. He put up all the hospitals, he cares about your health. says that every man should be the king of his domain. What's his name? What's his name? So if you think that you should share the wealth of our sweet land, if you see the king that lives inside of every man, if you have a dream to see your kids grow proud and strong, you can thank God and Huey Long. You can thank God and Huey Long. Thank God and Huey Long.
When I speak with Donald Jeffries, I find myself sounding like a person that I never thought I would be. And no, I'm not saying that Donald is the rowdy bad influence in the neighborhood. Not saying that at all. He's actually a very positive influence, and Survival of the Richest should be required reading for anyone about to enter the workforce. Or maybe it should just be taught. And I've told part of this story before, but I was a Reagan Republican as a teenager. I was Alex P. Keaton of Family Ties. I was jacket and tie, I was the perfect part in the hair, and I was an absolute defender of wealth, even though I was deciding with ever-growing frequency how I would spend my last dollar on campus. Do I wash one load of laundry and then hang dry, or do I get a soda from the machine? And sad to say, I usually got a soda from the machine. Yet, it was important to me that politicians allowed Leona Helmsley and Michael Milken to keep as much wealth as possible for themselves. After all, the American dream we are taught in schools tells us that all of that could be us someday if we just work hard enough. And it's a fallacy that Donald debunks in Survival of the Richest. So, to fight this important fight, one of the first things I did when I arrived on the campus of Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, was to join the Young Republicans. Now, I felt very much at home with them. What may surprise you is that these were not rich kids. These were kids like me, very lower middle class and many poor. Yet, we were, as we should have been because that was our role, we were bemoaning those who didn't work hard enough to rise to the top. In my youth, I was a janitor, a baseball field caretaker at a local park, a video store clerk, a McDonald's employee, a pretentious record store guru, a clothing salesman, and a customer service guy at Target. Twice. And you know what? Life has this way of making you see the world differently. People very close to me have faced extreme poverty, unsafe workplace environments, extreme sexual harassment, an overbearing prison industrial complex, a loss of First Amendment rights, and homelessness. Now, these aren't people who didn't try hard enough. These aren't even people who are uneducated. They're people who, for the most part, did everything right. One of the big lies that Donald discusses in Survival of the Richest is the college myth, that college means success. And that's not just the case now, that what happens is the marketplace has become flooded with graduates. So we're still teaching kids that they need to go to college so that they can work for someone else, someone richer, for say 40 years. We still aren't teaching entrepreneurship, at least not in a way that is so significant that it becomes the normal path to success. We still teach college as the only path, and it's a path that, to be honest, just isn't true. And I say that as someone with 3 degrees, a minor, and a national board teaching certification. I campaigned really hard and for free for the George H.W. Bush campaign in 1992, and that was also my last Republican vote. It's the last one I cast. Oh, wait. No. I did not give the Democratic Party my vote. I mean, after all, I'm not crazy. I've been a third-party supporter since 1996. I now consider myself a bit of a Ron Polish type of person, but I can absolutely also see the merit in the Huey Longs of the world as well. And to be honest, I'm not sure there are that many out there. So when someone asks me what I am, it's a pretty hard question to answer. Saying I'm an independent means, well, I think it means that I'm copping out. I mean, it usually is a cop-out, isn't it? That's what people say when they're trying to make you think that they are wiser than the next person. Wiser and more open-minded. Oh, I don't follow a party. I vote for the person. Yeah, okay. Show me someone like that, and I'll show you someone with zero grasp of the issues. What I know now is that the whole thing is broken, and maybe it's even rigged. The economic structure, the historical establishment, the education oligarchy, and the textbook conglomerates. It is broken. I wonder what the mood is like at some Madison Avenue or K Street gathering sometimes. In one corner, the Clintons and the Trumps take a picture together. In another, Rupert Murdoch shares a toast with George Soros. Eric Holder and John Ashcroft share what used to be illegally imported Cuban cigars, as Barbara Streisand laments to a Rockefeller heir that something must be done about this homeless problem. And then they both chuckle as they try to sort of eye the room to see if there's anyone more important they should gravitate toward at that moment. And I wonder if anyone stops. I wonder if anyone thinks. And I wonder if anyone there is even the slightest bit introspective. Does anyone have a moment where they look up, scan the room, and think, I guess this just didn't trickle down, did it? Or maybe it was never meant to. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
You can contact St. Patrick by email at midnightridernews@gmail.com. Join us on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show. Follow St. Patrick on Twitter at MWN_St. Patrick. We are LinkedIn at S.T.Patrick. And don't forget to follow Midnight Rider News on your YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and many of your favorite podcast providers. This has been a production of MidnightRiderNews.com and St. Patrick. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. We'll see you next time, and be good to the night.